It's interesting looking back at the narrative 10 years ago. How Nintendo was supposed to go bankrupt, right? What was supposed to happen? How Nintendo would fail and they would go third party and nobody would care about Mario or Zelda no more, right? How this was supposed to play out is that iOS was going to be so prominent, so successful, so ubiquitous that Nintendo could not possibly compete with their products. They could not compete with the iPhones, the iPads, the iWatches, right? Like Apple was going to take over the casual gaming market, right? While the hardcore market was dominated by Xbox and PlayStation. This was what everyone was saying with the advent of the iPhone, right? This culturally ubiquitous thing, right? Everybody has an iPhone, right? The mindset was that mobile gaming was huge, and as a result of that, Nintendo wouldn't be able to compete. Right? That was the narrative. That was what people believed. That's what people put out there. That's why so many people were certain that Nintendo would go third party. It did not happen. Not only did Nintendo not go third party, they became so successful that they've outpaced every other company in the industry and are now objectively the market leader when it comes to dedicated gaming hardware. The iPhone thing completely fell flat on its face. Why? Because Nintendo is putting out their own unique iOS products that are far superior to its competition. This has been the thing that people haven't really processed, right? This is not something people think about or really talk about, but Nintendo has had a lot of successes with iOS over the past several years. Most notably Pokemon Go, but there's also been Fire Emblem Heroes and the Animal Crossing one. A handful of products have come out on iOS, right? Just a handful. But really, a handful is all they needed, right? Because it's keeping their brand relevant, it's keeping it talked about, it's keeping it relevant to the iOS audience, and more of these players are making the shift over to the real thing on Nintendo platforms. We've seen this happen over and over again, right? We've seen Nintendo produce Fire Emblem Heroes and in spite of like the damage control from people like Angry Joe, like, oh no, are they abandoning their hardcore games? They continue putting out new titles in that franchise more than ever, if anything. To me, like the concern trolling about Nintendo games focusing entirely on iOS because that makes them more money has completely fallen on its face. Because this is an example of the Pokemon games and the anime coexisting with the video games, right? It is creating brand synergy, right? Nintendo doesn't need to put all of their products on Nintendo Switch in order to keep the Nintendo hardware relevant, right? They just released a Pokemon TCG, right? An app on that. I've been messing around with it like every couple of hours. Amazing, right? I've been having so much fun like opening packs and building my deck and like the Pokemon TCG from Dina is just phenomenal. I'm having so much fun with it. I could see this being a big deal. Like I could see this like continuing to grow the brand and keeping the Pokemon cards relevant, and of course keeping the Pokemon brand as a whole relevant. To me, it couldn't be more obvious that Nintendo's brand is just becoming bigger and more successful, while the competition, the iOS thing, stuff like Angry Birds, right? They have this huge, like, monumental thing, their growth, their relevancy on iOS and other platforms, and then they just fall by the wayside, or else get ported to Nintendo consoles, right? Angry Birds was supposed to be the next Mario. It should have been the iOS gaming mascot, and yet it completely fell by the wayside and became irrelevant in spite of the movie and in spite of like all the merchandise and all the success of like the original games. The IP just didn't really have any depth or creativity to it. The reality is, what Nintendo does is better than what iOS does. And as a result of that, people are leaning more and more towards Nintendo if they are interested in serious, hardcore experiences. The only thing that remains competitive on iOS are things from other established brands that have nothing to do with gaming. Things like WWE, like Star Trek, like all of this other subhuman trash, right? This does well because of these pre-established brands, not because the games are particularly popular or good. Again, we see this over and over and over again, and it's because of this, right? It's because of like the iOS thing where people get very, very upset when Nintendo starts dominating the iOS scene, right? We saw this with Pokemon Go when it was like the biggest thing ever in 2016 in that summer, where everybody was playing it, everybody knew about it. It was like this big hot thing. It made Pokemon relevant for everyone, right? It was essentially like a second wave of Pokemania, really. And the iOS shills were rattled by it because this demonstrates what's going to happen long term when it comes to Pokemon and when it comes to Nintendo as a whole, is that they are going to put out random products over and over and over again on iOS, and occasionally they are going to have major successes like it. And they only really need the occasional success on iOS, right? They don't necessarily need to be like dominating the platform all the time. Or even do they really want to, right? Because their goal is to keep their brand talked about, to keep it relevant, and to promote their existing products, right? One of the big things people noticed with Pokemon Go was that uh, Pokemon sales like skyrocketed after that came out. On the 3DS and Nintendo Switch, right? A lot of new people got into Pokemon because of Pokemon Go, and you're not going to be able to scare these people off by simply like regurgitating like nonsense complaints like Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was glitchy, because first of all that isn't true, and second of all, like if people play Pokemon and then play like lesser games like say Elden Ring or Baldur's Gate 3 or Starfield, like they're just gonna go right back to Pokemon. Like this has been happening to me for 20 years, actually longer than that now, but this has been happening to me for 20 years, right? Where you see some random thing being hyped up as like the Pokemon killer, you play it, you experience it, and then you go right back to Pokemon because no matter what the product is, it just isn't as good. And that's going to be the Nintendo experience for most people, right? They can be tricked into thinking Nintendo isn't great. They can be tricked into thinking Zelda wasn't Game of the Year, or that Pokemon is falling off, or that um, Nintendo's apps aren't very good. But the reality is quite a bit different, right? The reality is that Nintendo is very, very dominant in the gaming sphere, and there's just nothing that anyone can do to damage control that fact.